Welcome to Three Questions With. I'm Hugo, publisher of the Latino News Network and your host. Three Questions With is a public affairs program elevating the voices and visibility of matters most important to the Hispanic Latino community by speaking with community and industry thought leaders on the social determinants of health and democracy. Latinos play an essential role in shaping the U.S. economy. As one of the fastest-growing demographic groups in the country, Latinos have a very high labor participation rates. Latino-owned employer businesses continue to outpace white-owned employer businesses, with nearly 5 million contributing to over $800 billion annually to the U.S. economy. Yet the financial well-being of many Latino families does not reflect many of these economic contributions. Enter the Latino Policy Forum, an organization with a mission of building a foundation for equity, justice, and economic prosperity for the Latino community through advocacy and analysis. Sylvia Puente is the president and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum. She is our guest today. Sylvia, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Always a pleasure, Hugo.
And felicidades. The forum is celebrating su quinceañera.
Yes, we are. 15 years.
15 years. Let's start with those 15 years. Tell us about the work of the Latino Policy Forum and the issues that the forum leans in on.
You know, it's really a point of reflection when I think, first of all, that I've been at the forum 14 and a half of those 15 years, and I was on the founding board to see how we've grown from a staff of 3 and $500,000 to now where we are a staff, we're growing to 20, really looking at issues of education, housing, immigration as sort of pillars for economic mobility for the Latino community, but also being very intentional about our relationships with the African American community through our Leadership Academy, which brings together Black and Brown community leaders. And all of that, I think, is sort of circled by community leadership, because in all of our issues through our Acuerdo network, through our Latino agenda, we have constant dialogue with community leaders to really understand what's happening on the ground and how it impacts and influences us. And, you know, sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around what is policy and what is public policy and how do you make a difference in that area. So a couple of stories. One of our earliest victories and one of our core issues is ensuring that Latino children have access to early education. All the research says that if we can get children enrolled in quality early education, they're going to have a much better a much better educational trajectory, and then obviously leading hopefully to economic mobility. And so one of our earliest victories was we realized there weren't enough children in early education because there wasn't enough space. So we really led an effort working with a lot of other community partners and advocates in the early education space to get the nation's very first ever capital legislation passed to build early education facilities in under-resourced communities, many of whom were Latino communities. So we got, even before we could talk about educating our children, we needed a space to house them. So the capital dollars were to build facilities. So that's sort of one example of a public policy initiative. During COVID, we did a lot, and we really monitored a lot of the federal investments into Illinois. And one example, there were a lot of people that we know that were struggling economically through COVID. So we worked to get a nearly $500 million appropriation through our state General Assembly for rental and mortgage assistance for those who had fallen behind during COVID. And again, the public policy trajectory. We did the research and analysis on how that would impact Latino communities. We worked with the legislator on that legislation. We testified on the legislation, asked the governor to sign it, and once it got implemented, we worked with the organization, the housing department at the state level that was implementing it, to make sure that it would be inclusive of Latinos. And the beautiful thing about that legislation was everybody in the state was eligible, irrespective of their immigration status. And at the last leg of it, we brought together Latino community providers to work and talk to state officials on how to design the program and then we help to do outreach. So that's sort of an arc. And we think about how we do that in education, in housing, and immigration, and many, many other issues.
Yeah, it takes a lot of collaboration in order to garner a lot of the data that's needed to influence policy change. You mentioned MLA, the Multicultural Leadership Academy, that recently the 2023 cohort completed
Yes.
their session. Tell us about the importance of coalition building. This is a program that brings together Latinos and African and members of the African American community. Tell us more about MLA.
So I'm really proud of that because I think about the Latino Policy Forum as a data-driven organization, and we lead with defining and promoting what does equity mean for the Latino community, and how do we measure how close or not we are on any issue, educational attainment, home ownership. But I think of MLA, the Multicultural Leadership Academy, as a heart of the Latino Policy Forum because it is a very intensive training over 6 months where we take a cohort of about 24 Latino and Black leaders who work in communities and really help them understand each other, build trusting relationships with each other, and work on projects and aspects of community change. So they get exposure to public policy and what public policy is to help facilitate that change. But really, it's creating trust and long-lasting relationships that are going to serve our city. I think about it as it catalyzes a network that took me decades to build. They build that network within 6 months. I recently had someone who was in the first quarter of our MLA who's very prominent in the food justice world say to me, Sylvia, you have no idea of the relationships and the projects that I still continue to work on with cohort members who are in my MLA cohort, who I would have never had exposure, experience, and trust if it wasn't for MLA. So we really are, it's not making headlines, it's not in the newspaper, but we really are facilitating those networks across the city. We know Chicago is a very historically segregated city, and so it really is an intentional effort to bring together Black and brown community leaders to facilitate community change and improve our neighborhoods, our city, and our region.
Yeah, great. No, and congratulations on that. I think it's so important to bridge build between two groups that make up the majority of Chicago and Dade County, but often are pitted against each other. So to create a safe space for
Right.
them to, discuss and debate the things that they have in common, the things that they have not in common, and
And
working
intention.
together.
And
It's
there's
very
always
important.
huge light bulbs that go off, right?
Yeah.
So just one that often comes up is when the African American leaders realize, oh, colorism exists in the Latino community too, and just the shades of from many Latinos being from white to brown and what that looks like and how that plays out. We've been very deliberate and intentional in having a dialogue on looking at racism within the Latino community and internally how that shows up that sometimes we're not even aware because it's just so much of our norm and having really intentional conversations. And then during COVID, Emily really worked a lot on racial healing and brought together groups of community leaders, groups of participants, groups of youth to really think about what do we need to do to address this moment of time we're in and have racial healing.
Great, wonderful. Let's move on to the second topic. As you've mentioned, a lot of the work that the forum does is in producing reports, and most recently, the forum collaborated and led producing reports focused on Latinos in the suburbs,
Yep.
on education, on the census, on the Latino wage gap with Brookings, but all of them have a common thread, and that is that Latinos are not benefiting from the wealth that they're creating, or they're not getting their equal share of opportunities. And of course, there are exceptions here and there, but overall, we're still falling behind. Tell us a little bit about the reports of late that the forum has produced or co-produced, and tell us about some of those findings.
Yeah, so we're really fortunate in that as the Latino Policy Forum has matured, so is our capacity to be able to do really some groundbreaking research and analysis that hasn't been done before. And overall, I think it's just important to remind the viewers that there's a great report that came out that's called the Latino GDP report, and it's one for the nation and one for Illinois. And it really says how we are driving population growth in the state and the nation, labor market growth. All of the new people entering the labor force are Latino in Illinois. We're driving home ownership growth. We're driving household formation. So these are all catalysts for economic mobility, not just for the Latino community, but really important to the economic vitality of the state as a whole. Yet when we step back, and I often call it a Latino paradox, because while we're contributing in all these ways, a lot of the recent research and analysis that we've done says the paradox is that more of our households are earning over $75,000 a year, getting a foothold into the middle class, but we have the lowest per capita income, which means per person income among all racial ethnic groups. And half of Latino workers who work still earn $15 an hour or less. Another example is that we often think about home ownership as a foothold into wealth creation. And while we've seen home ownership basically remain pretty stable, increase a little bit in recent years, we found in our suburban study, for example, that 3 out of 4 Latinos who live in the suburbs live in the census tracts, the geographic communities, the neighborhoods that have the lowest property values, right? So yes, it's good to buy a home, but if you're buying a home that has a lower property value when compared to the region, how are you going to build wealth, right? When you don't have that kind of asset creation in your home, when you buy a home. So those are a couple of the different examples of what we would think about. And the forum's work is obviously to lift these findings, but more importantly, to really think then what are the policy solutions? What do we need to think about in terms of government responsiveness, government accountability, philanthropic responsiveness in order to address some of these trends?
In regards to responses, what, and not just in the recent reports, because there's a lot of more work that needs to be done. The reports are putting a light on some of the issues that exist. But previously, again, we mentioned the forum is celebrating su quinceañera. How effective do you believe the responses by, you mentioned lawmakers, policymakers, have been in regards to closing the gap for Latinos?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think we saw some really novel things happen during COVID, such as the home ownership investment that I mentioned. And we know that we live in a very blue state. And we definitely have seen that our Latino members, especially in our state legislature, they're newer, but they are many of them come from activist backgrounds. So I've often found that the door is open, but the systems don't realign to promote equity unless we really hold their hand and show them how to do it. And that really is the work of the forum. The openness, the responsiveness in general is there, but when you're trying to realign systems of inequality or systems to be more equitable, it's a challenge. And one simple example there is that during the decade of the 2010 to 2020, we saw the Latino population grow by 15%. So to continue to have equitable investment, we need 15% more resources just to stay even. We need those resources from government. We need those resources from philanthropy. But we're making that argument, but the systems are not designed to realign and restructure for that kind of additional investment.
Yeah. And as you said and before, it's a symbiotic relationship between the Latino community and Cook County, the state, and the country. So success for the Latino community equals success overall for
the state.
Communities. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, as we improve the economic well-being of the Latino community, it really is about our shared future. We're increasing the economic mobility for the state. And that is just so key because, as I mentioned, we're driving all of the state's labor market growth. Businesses in the state will not have a skilled labor force to hire from if we don't have an educated Latino labor force. Similarly, we're driving the majority of home ownership growth in the state, right? So there are just, it is a symbiotic relationship, as you say, in terms of our shared future.
Well, you're watching Three Questions with Sylvia Puente, President and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum. The native Chicagoan is going to come back and talk to us about her upbringing and her influences to do the work that she does today.
I'm Anna Valencia.
And I'm Connie Lindsay. And we're your hosts for Joy in the Breakthrough,
A podcast where we'll be talking to a wide range of leaders from different generations and backgrounds who have found power in being broken open.
Tune in every Monday at 7 o'clock p.m. on CAN TV Channel 19, streaming on cantv.org, and now available on the new CAN TV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
We've been talking to Sylvia Puente, President and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum, about building a foundation of equity, justice, and economic prosperity for the Latino community through advocacy and analysis. Now let's learn a little bit more about you. As I mentioned before, you're a native Chicagoan. Your roots are Mexican. Tell us about your upbringing and what motivated you, inspired you to do the work that you lead with the Latino Policy Forum.
Well, Hugo, some folks have heard this story that when people ask me what part of Mexico my family comes from, I say Texas. Both of my parents were born in Texas. In fact, my mother's grandfather settled the town that she was raised in just south of San Antonio. And they both came to Chicago as high school students with their families who had been migrant farm workers. So I often think about that in terms of being a migrant farm worker and following the crops and picking cotton and picking blueberries and picking apples. And their families, since they were each the youngest, decided they could make a lot more money in Chicago if they took factory jobs in Chicago in the 1950s. Manufacturing was a really booming industry there, and it was certainly an easier life than the life that they had been living. And then because each of them were the youngest in their families, they were still in high school. Each of my parents were still in high school when they came to Chicago, and they each then became the first in their family to finish high school. And I often think about that as them having that level of education when many people in our community and our parents and our grandparents had barely finished grade school. So the foundation then for me being the first, literally in the 4 generations on my mother's side, to finish college, right? And because they came from farm worker families, this is the 60s and the 1970s, they were activists and they were very involved with the United Farm Workers Union. And in fact, my mother took me to my first picket line when I was 13 years old. And that really just fooled my sense and was a steep introduction into the need for justice and how inequality shows up in the world. So in addition to sort of that formation, they also got very involved in the community. And one of the stories that I tell is when Head Start was being created, my father organized people to go to the school district because there was no Spanish-speaking person to provide Head Start. And the school district said, well, we don't have the money. So my father organized community members to raise money to hire a teacher or teacher's assistant. So they were very involved, and I think it was just an innate and intuitive for them because they had no formal training. But that really showed me how speaking up, that was the example, right, of how speaking up, you could see how differences could be made and how improvement could happen in communities. So sort of with that foundation, I was always an activist. I was always involved in things. But it wasn't until, through high school and through college, but it really wasn't until after college when I got a job working. Story I tell is I took a third of a cut in salary and I moved from Chicago to Springfield to have a fellowship in the governor's office. And I think about it now, I've taken salary cuts 3 times in my life which is a little crazy. But I don't regret it because each one was just an amazing learning opportunity in terms of what I got to do with my life and my career. And my second job in Springfield after the fellowship, I worked in the governor's budget office, which was amazing training for what I do today, to really have the broad systems view of how government works and how budgets influence. Budgets really are a reflection of our values. And I walked in there and realized that every other analyst had a degree in public policy but me. And I said, what is a degree in public policy? Because I had no clue. And this is literally more than 40 years ago now, Hugo. But then that really inspired me after my time in government. It's like, well, that's the graduate degree I'm going to get, because a degree in public policy gives you the tools, in my mind, for social change, the tools for how we think about equality and inequality in society, the tools for really how we can have a social impact.
Wow. I'll tell you, it is easy to see why, for us at Illinois Latino News, it was a no-brainer to nominate you as our hero in the inaugural Community Hero Initiative. So I invite you all to please visit IllinoisLatinoNews.com to learn more about our special guest today, Sylvia Puente, and to vote for her as the community hero. Sylvia, you've been so generous with your time.
Thank you.
You're one of my heroes.
Oh, you're so sweet.
You're someone that I look to and say to myself, I am not doing enough to provide greater visibility and voice to the Latino communities in the work that I do as a journalist, as a communicator. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do.
No, well, thank you, Hugo. And let me just say, you can't do this work alone. It's done in allyship. It's done with other groups of community leaders. And I'm just very privileged with the staff that I get to work with, the board that I get to work with, and the circle of dedicated community leaders who I feel like we're all on this journey together. So thank you.
Absolutely. It takes a village.
It takes a village, certainly.
You've been watching Three Questions with Sylvia Puente, President and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum. When we come back, La Última Palabra on Latinos Building Wealth.
Hi, I'm Bianca Cotton, host of Behind the Confident Smile. Tune in for a discussion about living with albinism with Brandy.
I have so many questions about my identity. I'm not getting the answers. I'm getting answers outside. I'm getting answers inside. I wasn't able to reconcile it because I was getting two totally different messages.
You can watch on CanTV 19, CanTV.org, and CanTV Plus app.
Joining me on the next episode of Every Day is a Yay is Deshauna.
I think you have to have discernment when you're listening to yourself or other people.
Yes.
For me, I struggle sometimes because I'm a collaborator. When do I choose to make the final decision and say no?
Join the conversation Thursdays at 7:30 p.m. on CanTV Cable Channel 19 and streaming on CanTV.org and the CanTV Plus app. Experience the power of community television.
And now, La Última Palabra, the last word on Latinos building wealth. Though Latinos have been one of the fastest growing demographic groups in the United States, the underlying causes of the wealth gap between Latino and white families are often misunderstood. White families have a median wealth of over $188,000, and Hispanic Latino families have a median wealth of just over $36,000, according to the 2019 survey of Consumer Finances. Narratives about Latinos' economic condition place far too much emphasis on the individual behaviors of the group, argues Brookings Metro Fellow Tonantzin Carmona, rather than focusing on structural factors like discrimination, racism, and segregation. Brookings Metro, in collaboration with the Latino Policy Forum, produced a report examining the Latino wealth gap and how to close it. The study focuses on Latino wealth, assets, and debt in 6 states, including Illinois. The Financial Health Network, in partnership with the Chicago Community Trust, found that Chicago's racial wealth gap exceeds the national average. In Chicago, 30% of Hispanic or Latino Cook County residents are financially vulnerable. Chicago is deeply segregated, FHN reports that almost 1/3 of the more than racially diverse residents on the South and West Side are financially vulnerable, while nearly half of the residents of North and Central Chicago are financially healthy. There's nothing wrong with us. There's nothing specific to the Latinos that impedes them from building wealth, says Carmona. So let us study the processes, the environments that prohibit us from building that wealth, and let's tackle those, she says. And that does it for this edition of Three Questions With, a collaboration by Illinois Latino News and CAN TV. LNN is dedicated to best serving Hispanic Latinos with local multimedia news and information websites across the U.S., including Illinois Latino News, a statewide community-focused initiative. I invite you to look us up on our websites and chat with us via social media. Tell us what you think about topics we talked about today, and please send me suggestions about what you think we should talk about in the future. Because at the Latino News Network, you are more than just an audience, you are our contributors. I'm Hugo. Thank you all for watching.